Welcome to Hope and Heresy, Life on the Religious Left, where we wrestle with contemporary issues using history and theology as our guides.
Our task is to reclaim religion for everyday people who want to live meaningfully without letting arbitrary doctrine or oppressive religious practice prevent us from asking big questions about our complicated world. I'm Reverend Sarah Lindsay.
And I'm Reverend Peggy Clark, and we're Unitarian Universalist ministers broadcasting from Community Church of New York, here in New York City. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Peggy.
We're back. I think, is this episode 3? I think it's episode 3 of season 2. And we are recording on the Friday before Election Day. So the whole country is in a state of suspended animation. We're just all waiting. I almost feel like nothing else is happening. Maybe that's just my life.
No, that's definitely true. The number of times I've heard somebody say, well, let's wait till after the election. Nobody's going to be able to focus. And it's true. I think suspended animation, I would also say heightened anxiety.
Yep. It feels like a sort of this hyper-American, everybody is aware of our country and how things work and our government in a way that we probably aren't usually. Yeah. And I know you and I were talking about what does it really mean, right? What is this moment really doing for us? Because people are so nervous about it. I mean, I'm nervous about it. I mean, I really feel like we're looking at, does this country move forward or does this country move backward? I'm honestly even wondering, are we dismantling this country altogether, right? Are we just, are we saying that none of the rules really matter and that it's, it's okay if the president breaks the law over and over and over again? And what is it, what are the implications for what's going to happen next?
So I think that's interesting because I feel like I've been having my conversation for 4 years with a lot of folks, right? For the last 4 years, I feel like in my congregation and among my peers, we've been talking about what is happening, right? Like, where are we as a nation? What are we doing, right? Are we, if things progress as they've been, right, we're like sort of essentially walking towards fascism, if we aren't already halfway there, dismantling the dream of America, such as it is, right? And that's really, I think, what we're sort of playing around in our minds today is this question of what is the dream of America? Where does it come from? Why do we keep pursuing it? Is it even possible to realize such a dream as this? Because I think that for me, at least, that is exactly what's alive and at stake right now, right? Is like, people keep saying Biden said it too, like the soul of America, right? Like, who are we? But it sounds a little, I'm making funny gestures because it sounds a little absurd. And yet it really is the question, right? Like, excuse me, it really is the question of the hour. Who are we and who do we want to be?
Well, and I think that, I mean, I'm going to say something a little political here, but I actually think Biden doesn't necessarily move us forward so much.
No,
at least he stops the bleed.
Yeah, he brings us back from the brink. Believe me, I'm not like on the Biden train. I mean, I'm on the Biden train, but he would not have been my first choice. I can say that. He would not have been my first choice. Because I would be pushing much harder to an even more progressive liberal agenda, right?
Right.
But he saves us from the brink and, points the ship back towards the founders' original ideals, which in and of themselves were complicated.
Right. Well, I think that, when this country was originally founded, and really around the time of writing all those documents and all those people we think of as the founding fathers, they were imagining something that was really glorious. And they created something, like they articulated something, and they institutionalized something that was brand new, and in some way was it was a dream, and they thought that they were creating it and it was going to happen, like in their lifetimes, that they were making this. And I think they didn't realize that it was going to take many generations, that we would have to keep unfolding and unpacking the dream that they were articulating. I mean, they themselves, right? You were talking about your son, and maybe you can tell us the story. They themselves weren't able to embody the very values that they were articulating.
Yeah, so Peggy's referring to just this week I was driving my oldest child to school. He's in fourth grade, and we were talking about Halloween, and he was Lafayette last year because he loves Hamilton, right? And so somehow Madison came up, and he was kind of like, "Boo, Madison, boo, Jefferson," and I was like, "Well, Jefferson did write the Declaration of Independence," and he was like, "Oh, well then, yay, Jefferson," and I was like, "But Jefferson did have slaves and like coerced a woman into a." So I mean, I didn't use the word rape with my fourth grader, but that's essentially what we're talking about, right? If we're real about this. Um, so I just like it is so complicated, right? I loved Jefferson as a kid, right? I read like biography after biography, and they were honest biographies. And I like sort of could see where he was like a bad guy too. But the ideals that he espoused, I just like felt so like amazing, right? And the problem is, yeah, like they had this notion, and you could say, if you were trying to be generous, right, you could say they were constrained by their time and their culture and their space. But that's like a cop out, right? Because in truth, I cannot believe that Jefferson, as smart as he was, did not know, right? Like he knew. And so there's this piece that's about it's the America hand in hand, like the ideals of the Declaration of the Constitution, and then the like American greed that kind of like was born at the beginning with it, right? Like I have these ideals, but I'm not going to change my life in order to make them true for everyone, right? I'm only going to make them true for me and my cronies.
I'm not sure that they even saw everyone. I mean, their idea of we, right? All men are created equal. I think that they really believed that sentence embodied everyone, and in some way it was radical, and not in some way, in a lot of ways, that was a really radical statement, right? Because the the hierarchy around class was um, fixed in too many ways. So the idea that we are equal, that you and I are equal regardless of our birth, regardless of land ownership, right? That we are somehow we have the same requirements and the same rights, and that we should all be afforded, the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is for all of us. What they didn't know is that they didn't see so many other people. They didn't see women, right? I mean, just off the, just, right there. They just didn't see women. They didn't see the African slaves. They didn't see anyone who wasn't white and Christian.
Yeah,
So
but that's an interesting. It's interesting, right? How accountable do you hold people for not seeing, right? Because like so all the time, right? You and I, we're not super necessarily committed to the scriptures in the way of people who believe that it's the word of God, right? So we look at the scriptures and we contextualize it in its time, and we sort of go, well, they wrote it this way because this was the world they lived in. And like, but this question of like, does that mean that then you take it for what it is, or does that mean that you adapt the text to the new times? Like, I guess it's just I clearly I like angst about this, right? Like I loved Jefferson, and Jefferson, oh, like, should we be? No, we shouldn't be. But like this question of like monuments coming down and stuff, and I'm all for it, right? But like, our founding fathers were slave owners, right? Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for what they wrote and what they imagined, right? We can say what you said, which is they just didn't see them, and that the whole American project in some way is, a widening of the circle, a widening of the vision, a bringing in, right, over and over, whether it's enslaved people, women, LGBTQ folks. It's a constant project of ever widening, right? That may be one way to frame like what is the American project, maybe.
well, for me, it feels like they were the people who had the vision, and every generation since then, we are the people who are trying to create the vision, right? Shirley Chisholm once said something like, "I'm in love with the dream of America." It's not what they envisioned has never been realized. So we're in this place of, for each generation, of unpacking, right? That's what we're doing. We keep building toward what they declared to be true. And an important part of that is becoming expansive,
Mhm.
right? Their idea was really constrictive, and I feel it in the country right now. We're constricting again. We're like pulling closer and closer. When the project, the experiment, was really about being expansive, about like how far can you stretch and pull people in. I think that's a Unitarian Universalist project also. Like we're pulling people to, and and we don't know. I mean, when I expand my arms, I don't know who's right beyond my fingertips. I mean, I can give you a list of all the people who say Jefferson forgot, and who, over time we have started, we've been including. But I am sure that there are people I haven't even considered. 10 years ago, I don't know that transgender would have been even in my, maybe not 10 years ago, but even in my idea, right, of who is at the fingertips, who's really out at the margins there. So we are like, so I think that's an important part of the project. I also think that they sort of kicked us off with um, this really gorgeous, optimistic vision of what was possible. And given where they were, by the way, my son's favorite character in Hamilton is King George. Just but but given where they were, right? Given King George, given all of it, given the racism and the sexism, right? Given the 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 medieval structures that they were trying to dismantle and move away from, given what they understood about science, and that human capacity was so much greater than they had before imagined, and that the shift from being, from sort of this magical thinking God creates everything, into, oh, there are principles and laws of science we can actually understand and manipulate, use to our advantage. That shift to the human center, right? I think, therefore I am. The shift to the I created a really different way of being in the world, and their sense, their optimism about that, their their belief that human beings can in fact create something that that is expansive, that is inclusive, that we can dismantle the old and create something new. That optimism, I think, continues to define us. I think we still live with the legacy of believing we can be more than we are.
With the legacy of believing we be more than we are in a good way. Like we
Yeah,
live with an optimistic vision of like we can be something better in the future.
yeah. I mean, I think that um, while they may have believed that they were articulating it and creating it, and that see, here we are. What we're living with is the idea that even if we're not there yet, we will get there. That this is progressive. That it's not. Um, it isn't static. That we're in a dynamic creation of who we're becoming as a country.
So there's two things that are occurring to me, and I'm going to throw them out there, and we can sort of see where we want to go with it. But the first is that I think there really is, though, a shadow side to that. Like what you just described is this sort of enlightenment, like in sense of the individual and the capacity of the human, and like, but the shadow side of that is the like focus on the individual instead of on the community, right? That like when you're so focused on like what am I capable of, that you sort of even forget to realize that there's something beyond your reach, right? Whether that's the people you're trying to include, or that's like the wonder of existence that is beyond your control and grasp, right? That like something is lost when the focus becomes so much on like human progress and human ability and individual, right? Like, so that's one thing that occurred to me as you were talking, right? Because I think that there is a way that that is part of what defines American, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we're going to go west. Like there's all this sort of like American conquering and moving forward, and it has to always be about, and we've talked about this before, right? It always has to be about progress, and it always has to be about innovation, and like it's never like, let's talk about community, let's talk about like, and yet at the same time those ideals are there, right? The community ideals are there. um so I don't know, I sort of, I go into that place of like everything has its shadow side, right? And that's, this is sort of the shadow side of the American, what we're seeing now in some ways, I think, is the shadow side of the American project. And that brings me to the other thing that I've been thinking about as we've been talking, which is you and I, from our liberal, religious, progressive perspective, understand, we can sit here and go, what these guys meant when they wrote was constrained by time, and they meant, though, this grand and lofty ideal. And I love the, like, I'm going to stretch my hands and what's beyond, like that. We can sit here and go, that's the project. The project is the ever including, ever widening arms, like go gadget arms as far as you can, right? Like, and we know, because of the last 4 years, if not the last 200, that there are plenty of people for whom that is not the project in America, right? There are plenty of people for whom the project, at least, like, let's say right now, is let's go back to that time when I didn't have to share a water fountain, or let's go back to that time when I, the middle class white person, was on the top of the heap, right? And it's like, in this totally weird and misguided way of trying to go back, right? Like it's misguided on many levels, but like the reality is not everybody understands those founding documents the way you and I do. Or not everybody, maybe it's that not everybody sees differently than Jefferson, right? Like if we're saying that Jefferson and those guys, they just didn't see those folks, there are still a lot of Americans who don't see those folks or don't care to, right?
So I guess the question then is, are we trying to, is the experiment um literally as it was articulated, right? It is only for this group of people, or is it about um embodying it over time with new understandings? And I would argue that the people, not all of them, but a lot of the people right now who think that no, this really is about white men, that they weren't white. They weren't considered white at the time.
Yes. And or, I've always found it fascinating when people who's like, people who are accepted sort of culturally as white folks, but whose, European ancestors came a generation or two ago, right? So like relatively new. And I have relatives like this, and who are like, we should close the borders. Nobody knows the immigrants. And I'm like, what? Where do you think you came from, right? Like, so I agree with you that this is part of the misguided piece, right? Like a lot of the folks being like, let's go back to the glory days. They didn't have, theirs were not the glory days, right? Like they were not the wealthy landowning white men, right? They would have been in some ways, the working class, whatever. Like so I agree with you. And yet there is this like this thing that gets pushed of like, if you're a patriot, if you're, this is what you believe about America, and it's some sort of like 1950s immediately post-war, like, what is it, the Cleavers? Did I ever, what was that show?
Leave it to Beaker.
Yeah, Leave It to Be, like some sort of like the wifey stays at home and the man goes to, like, there's some sort of vision of like middle class white America that people are trying to hang on to, um that for you and me doesn't resonate, right? And doesn't make any sense. um but I think that's the tension of this moment, right? Is, do you believe that it's the every time, every moment we are reassessing that lofty vision and pushing it and renewing it and recommitting to it in our context? Or are we like strict constructionists and we're like, this is what they said and meant, this is how it was then, this is how it must be now, right? it makes me think of the Supreme Court, right? And like
I'm thinking the same thing.
because that's exactly because it is, right? It's all of a piece, right? Like, do I look at the Constitution and I do, right? I've got that strict constructionist thing, right? And I interpret it as like, it was written this way, this is what it meant, this is how it goes. Or do I think of it as a living document that gets, adapted and reinterpreted over time through lived experience? And also, PS, we can map that right onto like liberal religion, right? Do I view the Bible as static and how it should be all time, or do I reinterpret it as a living document that gets adapted and evolves for our time and our living, right? All of these things can layer right on each other.
Do you remember that there's like that panel of theologians like Marcus Borg and was Brueggemann? I'm trying to remember who was on it, and they did that like Jesus, historical Jesus, like reconstructing the historical Jesus. And they did it over a long time, 5 years, 10 years, I can't remember. And
Jesus Project, right? Isn't that what it's
Jesus
called?
Project, right? Something.
That's what it's called. To
And
Google it.
the idea was like go back and figure out exactly like what was the historical time, exactly what was happening, what was this said in response to, or the larger historical context. And it was seen as really radical, but their idea was the same as what's happening. The question is the same, right? Do we just take the text as it's written, or do we understand it in its context so that we can interpret it for our time? And that does feel like the tension on the Supreme Court. It feels like a tension in Scripture, and and in this American experiment, in what American life really is. Is it, are we trying to create something? Are we using kind of inspiration, or are we trying to recreate exactly what was at another time? Which to me seems completely bizarre, because how could you possibly? And if, frankly, any of those people who wanted to recreate it understood what it was, they would know that they weren't included in it.
Right. Or frankly, that it was not as nice as it sounds, right? Like whenever, there was that moment in time when like people would respond to like sort of anti-homosexual Bible rhetoric with like, well, if you believe that, then you shouldn't be eating whatever, or you should be like fasting every day, or like people would sort of point back and go, well, if you're going to be literal, then you've got to take the whole thing literally and do, and that's kind of right, right? Like if you're going to be literal, you got to be literal. And so I think it's, this question of how do we take something written hundreds of years ago, make it real and alive for everyone, and make sure that it is constantly renewed and recommitted to, right? How do we not make an idol of like a moment in time? Um, and
Mhm.
I think it goes back to what you said at the beginning, Peggy, in many ways, which is like, if we think that the founders thought of themselves as like channeling some forever after word of God, like, don't mess with this thing, then that's one thing. But if we thought of them as men who had dreams of what was possible, that allows us to look at it in a different way, right? And understand it and use it in a different way. Yeah.
I also think that some of this divide is between people who actually have the information and people who only have an imagination, right? That I think we imagine something, and what we all know is where we are right now isn't good enough. And some people imagine that it was good enough
For
somewhere in the past, and they just don't know. They I often think the difference right now between Republican and Democrat is, or Biden, Trump, is people who know what's really happening and people who don't really know and are living in the hopes of something rather than in solid information.
well, but I also think you sort of said there too, the difference between being able to imagine something else. So there's a really big difference between let's go back and let's step into the unknown. right? And so I think part of what gets wrapped up in it is not just what we know or don't know, but our capacity to imagine, and also our willingness to change, right? Because change is really hard. I mean, because when I think about this idea about going back, right, I think about that Langston Hughes poem, like "Let America Be America Again," right, which is basically actually says because America was never America for most of us, right? So this idea that like, how do we imagine and envision a dream for the future and step into it not afraid? Because I think some of it is about fear, right? Some of it is fear of change, some of it is fear of being lost or becoming the one who's unseen. I'm not justifying any of it. I'm just saying, I think wrapped up in it um, is a lot of complicated stuff. It's a weird moment.
It is a weird moment. And I know that we weren't necessarily going to end with a moment of action or a moment of hope, but I want to anyway.
Okay.
Because I think that for the American experiment to work, we really have to be engaged. We can't just allow government to make all of the decisions or people with money and power. That what makes the American experiment successful is that average people are the real power. But we are only the power if we decide we are. We we shrink back so much. And I think that our moment of action really needs to be about engaging, right? If you're someone who doesn't really know, commit to something like reading the newspaper every day. Pick one, the New York Times, Washington Post, pick a paper and read it and become someone who knows.
I like that. I like that as a moment of action. And I'm thinking about because now my mind is stuck back with Langston Hughes. But I'm thinking about this question of um, patriotism. And so this idea of like, and our producer Amy sort of brought this up with us, and I think it's really important though, right? Because so often patriotism gets shoved at us as like respect the flag, or like, be pro-war, or like it comes in all these funny forms, right? And for me, when I think about it, because like I still love Jefferson a little bit, right? And like I hate America, but I also still love America, right? So, like, because I hate the America that's been and I love the America that could be, right? And I think that actually is patriotism, right? Is being able to say, here's what's wrong, and I love you anyway, and I love this vision, and I'm visioning with you. And so, yeah, like for me, I guess the moment of hope is like, we don't have to give up on the project. Like the progress has been glacial for many folks, right? It has taken a long time. It should, in some ways, in my heart, I think it should not have taken this long to get a lot of the things done that we're like slowly getting done, right? To wrap as these everyone in, right, is taking too long, but it's happening and it can still happen. And so I just think that like the sort of, for me, the hope is we don't have to throw it all away, right? I can teach my son to hate parts of who Jefferson was, and I can teach him to love parts of what Jefferson envisioned for the world, right? Like you can it's tense, but you can hold those things together, right? So you can be a patriot and still be mad as hell, right? And that's hopeful. Even that right there, you can be Langston Hughes and still being like America has potential, like that's a hopeful thing.
I was listening to someone talking about what has happened um, in the international conversation around kind of Trump in the last 4 years, and so much of that was that leaders, but just average people in other countries watching us struggle so badly, and their experience of losing hope. And it occurs to me that this country has become a symbol of what's possible.
Mhm.
And as they watch to see, can that great and powerful country overthrow fascism without war, right? Peacefully. Can they simply move the authoritarian dictator out and move somebody else in as part of their system? That's an incredible sign of hope for people. Our experiment has defined for people around the world what is really possible.
I think what'll be really interesting though is that it won't be enough to just do that, right? It isn't enough if on November 4th we wake up and it's clear, or 10th, or whatever it turns out to be after all the ballots are counted, on whatever day, and Biden has won, and the military escorts Trump out of the White House, like and it's all peaceful. That won't be enough, because this whole thing has exposed more and more breaks in the system. So for me, the real test will be, do we then have the strength and the hope and the purpose to rewrite what we need to rewrite to prevent future creeping fascism, right? And to open the circle even wider. And like, are we going to be able to rewrite our asylum policies and immigration policies to be inclusive and open and like coming from a place of community and compassion? Like, for me, that's the test, is have we learned anything from this, and are we going to be able to put in place and stop looking at everything as static and put in place new things that really reach for that dream?
You know what, Sarah? That sounds like next week's topic.
I guess so. We'll check in after the election, folks.
That's right. We'll find out. Stay tuned.
Listeners around the world, wish us luck. Yeah, it'll be an interesting week here in America. All right. Nice to talk to you, Peggy.
You too. See you next week.